Hi, Timberwolves. Ms. Rebellino coming in with a review video to help you with the World Wars, Great Depression, and Dust Bowl. So please remember on Canvas, there is the review sheet with the key if you need to review anything from there. So let's go ahead and let's kind of begin with our journey. So just to kind of set the scene and have you guys understand, we kind of talked about urbanization in our prior unit, and we talked about how things were not really regulated, especially during the Gilded Age. And what we start to see now is these reform movements starting to happen. We see these labor unions starting to form, and they're starting to go ahead and push back and get better working conditions. Children are going to school. Women get the right to vote in 1919 with the 19th Amendment. So we see all this happening, making America a better place. But we also start to see there's a lot going on in Europe. So let's take a look and see what's happening. You need to remember Europe is set up with a bunch of monarchies. And what's happening is that Europe is taking over many other nationalities. And this rise of nationalism begins to come on up where people feel they deserve or should have their own boundaries to practice their own culture, speak the same language. Because you find that that's not really happening. Take a look at England and how much they take over. The famous saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, the Habsburg Empire, which be considered Austria-Hungary, kind of pushing down into Slavic areas that feel that they should be free because a German monarchy really shouldn't be taking them over. So this is kind of what we begin to see, that imperialistic idea that these larger countries that are well developed, have been around longer and have strong armies, are going and taking over these countries and taking their resources for themselves to benefit themselves and the people or their citizens. And that's where nationalism comes up in Europe, which then leads to a lot of political issues. And we begin to see new countries begin to form, specifically after the Berlin Conference. Germany, Italy, these are all countries that used to be small little city-states, and now they are their own countries. So they begin to build up their armies. But if you kind of take a look over here at the chart, between 1910 and 1914, we see that Germany spends about 73% on their defense system. And this begins to worry neighboring nations like France and Russia. So World War I primarily starts because of these reasons from the previous slide. We begin to see imperialism, nationalism, which are huge reasons why this is happening, and militarism. This begins to scare many people. And finally, the straw that breaks the camel's back is going to be the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand from Austria-Hungary with regard to Bosnia. So just to kind of help you understand what happens after the Archduke is killed, he is the next one for the throne. Declarations of war begin to go ahead and be given, and then these alliance systems that were kind of set forth due to the militarism begin to have a domino effect where everyone is declaring war on everyone. Hence, World War I breaks out. So that's just kind of how World War I starts in a nutshell. The United States at this time is really starting to have this ideology of isolationism, not trying to get involved, and really feels that they should just kind of just stay out of it, specifically if they're on the other side of the world in the Western Hemisphere. So with this new war comes this new push forth into technology. We begin to see that these countries, which have lots of money and have been building up, have been coming up with new types of technology, like the Maxim gun, different types of weapons, gas masks, flamethrowers, and eventually leading to each side having the same type of technology advances, making it very hard to fight and also making it a very deadly war. So in sight of that, they go ahead and they build these trenches on the Western Front. And they begin to go ahead and use these trenches to kind of keep themselves lower so they can go ahead and fight. And then we begin to see that there is this in between these two sides with the trenches called no man's land, where no one can really get through. So the only way to go ahead and win this war is by advancing over to the enemy's trench, taking it over. But unfortunately, because of this trench warfare, it began to be very, very tedious, horrible living conditions, horrible conditions in general, shell shock, trench foot, and really not being able to go ahead and advance. So the war takes 4 years, and men are getting tired, and it begins to be a huge issue, specifically with disease, because of how bad these trenches are. As we begin to go through, the United States eventually can no longer stay out of this war due to the fact that they do have some sympathy towards Great Britain. In England, obviously being our once mother country with the 13 colonies, we begin to have these ties. We have the same language, we have very similar cultures. So America kind of has these ties with Great Britain and does eventually begin to go and give money and food and different types of supplies that they need. This eventually does become an issue with the Germans because they do not want England to get these advances because they're trying to go ahead and win this war. So during this time, Germany has these U-boats, and they said they would never use them on passenger ships, but they do for fear that America is sending weapons on them. And so they sink these passenger ships where there are a few Americans on it, and this really gets the United States upset. But eventually, what really leads America into the war is the Zimmerman telegram, where Germany sends a letter to the Mexican president asking for his help to attack America. And if they win, they'll go ahead and give them the land lost in the Mexican cession from the Mexican-American War in 1848. So this obviously is a huge threat to America, specifically Texans, because if you think about it, they are a part of that Mexican cession. So this really resonates with Americans. And finally, they decide to enter the war in 1917 and bring hope to the Entente alliance, a new, fresh set of men, eventually leading to the victory. So what happens is World War I ends and the Treaty of Versailles is signed. And fun fact for you, the Treaty of Versailles is called the Treaty of Versailles because Versailles is in France. France wanted to make sure that the Germans had to come onto their territory where majority of the war happened, destroying their land and just leaving them with very, very little infrastructure or land to go ahead and grow food because everything has just been destroyed with trench warfare, missiles, and the new technologies. So at this time, the Treaty of Versailles, you can kind of see, was very, very, it was drafted in a way to punish the Germans. You can kind of see the Germans were excluded. They had to go ahead and pay this large amount of money that was just completely not fair, remembering that they also had other people on their alliance like Austria-Hungary and Italy. So we begin to see that this really does not resonate well with the Germans, and eventually it's going to come back and bite everyone in the tushy. So Germany wasn't allowed to have an air force. They had to downsize their military. They had to get rid of a lot and basically had no say in the matter, as you can see from the political cartoon above. So this really resonates with the Germans, leading them to a Great Depression where thousands are starving and this hatred starts to build up, specifically with one man, Adolf Hitler. So as we start to see, World War I eventually ends with a victory to the Entente Alliance, and we begin to go ahead and see these impacts specifically with Texas. Why? Because this is Texas history. So please understand that one of the things we need to remember is that Texas has large amounts of military bases, and this becomes a huge advantage for America because we are a huge state with lots of land available and located associated in the South with great weather. We also have many people who are wanting to fight in the war. As you can kind of see, we have a large amount of men coming in. Texas also has lots of industry, which begins to grow. Oil, if you remember, from cotton cattle railroads and the oil industry and Spindletop. So this solidifies the oil industry in Texas, creating this huge boom and urbanization growth. So you can see that cars, factories, and agricultural industries are starting to go ahead and increase because America at this point is feeding the world because of wars going on in Europe. They're providing oil for different types of countries because they don't have it. They had a war. So Texas really becomes a leading factor in this. And as you can kind of see from the political cartoon, there is a huge impact. And Texans are very, very proud about this. So just kind of think of it in this particular way. Women also became involved during World War I, going into the workforce because men were away. They also began to have this type of discrimination and prejudice towards German immigrants for fear of spies or anything like that. We'll see this again in World War II. And we see that a lot of sacrifices had to be made by Americans on our home front because we needed to feed men, we needed to go ahead and help. So this is kind of what we begin to see. After World War I, we see this huge growth inside of our economy because everything was completely destroyed in Europe, leaving America, which really the war wasn't fought on, to be the provider of the world. Industry begins to grow, jobs are plentiful, and everyone is making money. And we begin to see that the American economy booms and urbanization begins to go ahead and grow in specific areas, specifically in Texas, because of everything we have to offer. New cars, refrigerators, cameras, vacuums, all this new technology begins to go ahead and come out, and everyone wants to buy one. New companies like GE, Johnson & Johnson, all begin to come out, and everyone is buying stocks. And eventually it's due to poor regulated stock practices, which leads to other issues with America falling into a Great Depression. But the Roaring 20s began to be an issue where people, specifically in the United States, did not believe that they were going to fall into a depression because they thought everything was going to be good. As you can kind of see with the political cartoon here, America is looking back at ancient Rome where they felt everything was well at their highest point. And the United States is being seen here as being prosperous, and they feel they're never going to fall. But eventually we understand that they do. And it is one of the worst economic depressions ever in history. So the Great Depression hits, and it basically leads to many people being out of work, people starving, high unemployment, a lot of depressed people, millions and billions of dollars lost due to the fact that America is not providing as much to the world because Europe is building up, and they begin to go ahead and kind of not trade so much. They're focusing on themselves, and this does affect our home industries. They eventually have to lay off, which increases unemployment. And eventually too much is overproduced, leading to overproduction, high tariffs being created, and then a stock crash, the Black Tuesday, October 24th in 1929, signifying the start of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression was basically with Herbert Hoover. During that time, he was basically put in office or voted in office during the time that America was doing great and they were being prosperous and everyone loved him. Hoover was a great businessman and was definitely put in place due to his business knowledge. Unfortunately, what we start to see is after the collapse of the stock market and the Great Depression continuing, Hoover really doesn't exactly know what to do. He believes in a laissez-faire policy, which means he doesn't want to touch businesses. He wants businesses to kind of come out of this on their own. And as you can see here in the political cartoon, it is very hard for him to kind of deal with this. He begins to then become blamed for the Great Depression because he does very little to go and help Americans. So once the economy collapsed, Hoover's to blame. They called these poor communities that were made of cardboard boxes Hoovervilles. Hoover was very, very wealthy, and many people blamed him for that. Problems during the Great Depression were so horrible and treacherous that it just became a part where policies that he was putting in were not effective, not giving that relief that the American people so wanted. Once the election comes in, Hoover obviously loses, and we begin to see a new president comes in and acts like America's white knight. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at the Great Depression. We can see these causes from this chart. You have foreclosures, banks closed down, stock markets completely collapsed, low wages, unequal wealth distribution. Basically, what that's your Robin Hood scenario. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Overproduction, as I explained before, international depression. It leads to a world depression, specifically looking in Germany, and then excessive credit buying on items, which means you're purchasing stuff that you are supposed to pay back, but unfortunately can't due to a depression. So these impacts are going to be pretty large when we're looking at these effects: food shortages, unemployment, evictions of home, banks foreclosing, Hoovervilles, when we begin to see like where people are living, businesses and people go bankrupt, soup kitchens, communities have to come together. So you can look back at some political cartoons and you can see how horrible it was, but you could also see a lot of people during this time believed it to be the best of times and the worst of times, because communities began to come together and help each other, like setting up soup kitchens, helping each other out, just being very friendly and neighborly. But it still was a horrible time, looking at 30% of unemployment and people not having much food to rely on. The United States and the West was not really impacted during that time because they had their farming, but eventually the overproduction of farming leads to something that is going to be the worst man-made catastrophe ever in US history. So again, look at these economic, social, and political impacts. We begin to see that there is, again, high unemployment, and eventually the FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, comes in, and he comes in on his white horse to save the day, and we'll go into kind of how he does. So during this time, after the stock market crashes, the Midwest is a large farming, agricultural part of the United States. Due to poor practices and not really taking care of what they need to do, people are over farming. They are upsetting the soil, and eventually 10 years of drought come and pays their price. We begin to see that a series of drought lead up to a large, massive dust storms, which affect the areas of Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas, and Colorado. So we're seeing farmers are impacted because their crops are devastated, respiratory health issues like dust pneumonia, unsanitary living, lots of crime, debt, people losing their homes, and eventually having to leave and move out of this particular area because there was nothing left for them. So impacts of the Dust Bowl, as you can see from this map here, people are migrating out, many of them moving to California to be migrant farmers. And if you remember from class, migrant farming isn't some glorious job. You are migrating, which means you are moving around, going from farm to farm, being paid very little, and also not being in a good living condition. So it is better than starving, but many people left. So we see that the environment was completely destroyed, 10 years of drought. We see locusts and jackrabbits. So we see they are also starving as well, looking for food, and they just consume anything that is left, which then affects the people. Strong winds, dust storms, people getting sick, starvation, economic, agricultural industry is destroyed, and eventually the government has to come in and help, and that's what leads to this New Deal program. So you can see here in this political cartoon, Hoover just is being displayed here as not being able to do anything, and is very excited to go ahead and drop this problem on FDR's door. So you can see that it was a lot for FDR to come into. So the whole point of the New Deal during this time was to set up policies to help lessen the burden of the Great Depression on the American people. They set up relief programs to provide jobs, recovery to get the economy back on track with banks and industries, and reform to banks and to abolish child labor, along with the overall objective to save capitalism. And that's the whole point of the New Deal. You can see here, there's some key Texans in here, and we have John Garner and Sam Rayburn. So John Garner was the running mate with FDR. He's from Texas, and he was well known. In fact, 88% of Texas voted for FDR and Jay Garner because of his ideas of the New Deal and coming up with great ideas to lessen the burden of the Great Depression on the American people. Sam Rayburn, also a Texas representative that helped with reforming the stock market and getting poor farmers electricity where it really wasn't found. So we begin to see some key Texans coming in and helping out with the New Deal. So some New Deal programs, so you understand these reforms. You have the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This was to go ahead and protect banks, but also protect the people investing in the banks. You need to understand when the banks fell, people didn't trust them and no one wanted to invest. So the government came in and decided to go ahead and be the insurance to these bank accounts. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, this basically paid farmers to plant less. So this way it would increase the crop prices. Because if you remember the laws of supply and demand, when you have an excess of product and a lot of it, the price goes down, which then affects the farmers from selling their crops. So this was able to go ahead and control the price of these farmlands to be able to increase the price by controlling the amount that is made. Unfortunately, it was not very successful for small farmers. It was more for large farmers, but eventually gets reformed again, and this still exists today. The Civil Conservation Corps, which was meant to help with jobs and farming. You had the PWA, the Public Works Administration, which helped with public parks, different types of recreational areas in the United States, many found in Texas. So this kind of helps out. We also have the National Youth Administration, which focused on helping people, specifically young people, to come back into the workforce, and Social Security to help the people that everyone forgets, and that is the starving senior citizens that don't have work. So this gives them that job, that what they did work, it gives them money to be able to go ahead and survive. So you can understand these New Deal programs are amazing. However, they did not pull America out of the Great Depression. They just softened the blow. As from a famous singer, you could say it's just basically putting a Band-Aid over a bullet hole. It only stops it for a little bit, but it's not going to save you. And that's basically what's happening. Eventually, we begin to see controversy inside of the United States politics, where FDR wants to spend more, but a lot of the other people are kind of being a little bit more conservative and don't want to because they feel it's going to put America in debt. But eventually, America does come out of the Great Depression, but it's not because of the reason of spending money. It's more for war. And that's what leads us to Europe in the 1930s. If you remember, Germany was completely obliterated with the Treaty of Versailles, being left with nothing and absolutely hating democracy and hating people around them that made Germany sign these deals or accepting them in the treaty. So we begin to see this rise of fascism, and it basically takes over Europe in places like Italy, USSR with the rise of communism, and other nations in Middle and Eastern Europe. So just to kind of understand what is fascism, fascism is basically where you have an authoritarian, so authority, like full authority, takes over your life. You could take a look at this wheel that kind of sees, you see economic functions are controlled by the states. Political, there's only one party, that's it. There is no other party. If there is, they're going to disappear and go on a permanent vacation. Cultural censorship. News is basically censored. Basic principles are determined by the leaders. So we see total control. And it's almost like you can't eat or sleep without permission, as just how strong it was. That was just more a figure of speech. It wasn't true. So just to understand that these begin to thrive because people want to be taken care of, and they just don't know what else to do because they're tired of starving. They're tired of these policies that are coming through falling apart. So Hitler begins to take control, and he begins to promise the German people revenge, as well as prosperity and security. And the people invest in him. He begins to go ahead and avoid the Treaty of Versailles with increasing militarism and building the army, building the Air Force, building his navy, and no one is really stopping him. We begin to see him taking over specific German areas that were taken away from them, specifically Rhineland, which is to the east going towards Russia. That is taken away from them. We begin to see a growing Germany, and this begins to worry many people. But again, they do not stop them. As you can see right here, he takes over the Rhineland, he takes over Austria, he takes over part of Czechoslovakia, and no one stops him. Why? Why do they not stop him? It comes to a point you need to remember World War I and the destruction that it caused resonated with many Europeans, and they were afraid of something like this to happen again. So they figured if they appeased Hitler, he would just stop and everything would be fine. You also need to remember these countries were dealing with their own political issues with imperialism. These countries were starting to fight back, and it cost a lot of money, specifically looking in areas like India, Africa, Australia, kind of where England is. France is still trying to come back from World War I and all the destruction happened. So it is just a mess. And Hitler's taking advantage of this. And eventually he does succeed. And World War II does start because eventually he just takes it too far. So World War II basically starts because, again, rise of fascism. We begin to see other countries like Japan who want to expand and help their people by taking over other areas like imperialism, as I mentioned, taking over another country to benefit your own and use their resources. Economic depression, anti-communism, appeasement, militarism, rise of Hitler, Treaty of Versailles, and nationalism. But the big four you need to know are the Treaty of Versailles, rise of fascism, Hitler, and the appeasement policies. This leads to World War II breaking out. And again, the United States staying out of it. They don't want to be involved. They're trying to recover from a Great Depression. So eventually they are thrown into it because of Japan spreading out. You need to understand that America wants to go ahead and trade with Asia because of all the resources and the opportunities for growth in the Pacific. So Japan thought that the US would eventually intervene with their conquering of other nations. And so they basically began to go ahead and decide to take it into their own hands. And the way they did that was to go ahead and attack Pearl Harbor. And this does lead to a lot of loss of men and a lot of issues with losing many men in the Navy. So you could see on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked, which is in Hawaii, killing thousands and thousands of men. So America joins the Allies power, which is Great Britain, France, China, the Soviet Union, and they come in and they're fighting to end this fascist societies, which is the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. So as the war goes on, we begin to see a lot more damage to Europe, and we begin to see the United States is actually being greatly affected by this war because they're not coming in so late. They're coming in literally in the beginning of the war. We begin to see a lot more losses of men. We begin to see a lot more issues. But what we eventually have is America being pulled out of the Great Depression because men are being overseas fighting, getting paid. Other people that are back home are taking their jobs. Women are working. So we need to build more factories, to build more weapons, to preserve food to send over to our troops. So America is essentially one positive of it is being pulled out of the Great Depression. But it does lead to a lot of controversies with the presidency of FDR being in so long, more than 8 years, in fact, 12. So Texas is a huge impact, just like World War I. We are always there to go and support by giving oil, by giving farming, by giving men, by providing support to America. So Texas is a huge state that is very important inside world wars and the United States stability. So we see 22,000 Texans die from this war, which is huge. Military bases are very popular because of, same as World War I, we begin to see it's warm, we have large amounts of land, we have experienced pilots, we have all these things forming an inside of Texas, which benefits the war efforts. We begin to see that industry begins to grow in Texas again, because now we need to feed these men and these military bases. So we begin to see consumer goods being made, tanks, whatever needs to be done inside these factories, and jobs just being plentiful now. Again, increasing that urbanization inside of Texas and other areas. So the direct impacts on Texas and the citizens are going to be the sacrifices being made, not eating as much, giving up meat, giving up wheat so we can send over, stopping using certain metals and rubbers so we can use it for the direct war efforts because it was needed for supplies. So we begin to see that Texas really had a huge impact on this, as well as the world, where we supplied 40% of the oil for the nation. We went ahead and we grew serving overseas in the military, as well as the need for workers presented with different types of races, like Latinos and African Americans. And this becomes a huge impact eventually later, leading to the NAACP and LULAC, which are organizations to help people of color and different ethnicities to be able to find work. So Germany eventually has to surrender due to the fact of invading Russia and not doing well, and America coming in during D-Day and Normandy, France, winning. But Japan at the time, which is in the Pacific, is not giving up. So the United States decides to use their secret weapon, which is the atomic bomb, dropping it on Hiroshima, which is the first, and then Nagasaki, which led to obvious damages that would be rendered for years and years to come. But eventually Japan surrenders in 1945 of September, ending the war. So this concludes the review video. If you have any questions, please take a look online, and I will be available tomorrow morning for tutorials if you need me. Take care. Bye-bye.